A homemade yeast roll hot out of the oven, slathered with butter is my favorite bread, particularly during the holidays. For several years, I didn't eat gluten and was determined to create a yeast roll recipe I could enjoy. I have two recipes I'm sharing with you today. One has plain white rice flour as the main flour for a cleaner, less complex recipe. The other uses a gluten-free flour mix. While taste and texture differ, both will satisfy your yeast bread craving. You pick the one that suits you best. Let's check out both recipes and compare them. For the ingredients of both gluten-free yeast roll recipes, you'll need milk, yeast, granulated sugar, tapioca starch or flour, xanthan gum or guar gum, baking powder, salt, egg, butter, and either a gluten-free flour mix like Namaste or finely ground white rice flour. Aside from the flours, the recipe is the same for both. I'm making two recipes at the same time so that we can compare them, but of course you pick the recipe that works best for you, that seems more appealing, or based on the ingredients that you have. We're going to start by greasing a 9 by 13 inch baking dish, and since I'm doing two at a time, I'm going to grease two dishes at a time, but you only need to grease one. And for these rolls, since the primary fat in this bread is butter, I am using butter to grease my pan, but you can use cooking spray or whatever you want. And then set your pan aside. So in a measuring cup, we're going to add 295 milliliters of milk, and we're going to heat the milk up in the microwave for 30 seconds and add an additional 10 seconds or so until we reach 100 to 110 degrees. In a small bowl, go ahead and measure out 50 grams, which is a quarter cup of granulated sugar. And then you're going to add to a small bowl 12 grams, which is 1 tablespoon of yeast. From the sugar that you've already measured out, you're going to add 1 tablespoon of that sugar to the yeast because we need to activate the yeast. And then take the milk that you've heated up. Just you can eyeball it, but you're going to add about a quarter of a cup of milk. That's about it. And then you're just going to stir that together. And then we're going to set this aside for 10 minutes for the yeast to bloom, become bubbly and frothy. I'm doing the same thing for my second batch of rolls here. So go ahead and dice 57 grams, which is 4 tablespoons of butter. And you're going to add that to the remaining milk that you've already measured out. And we're going to heat the milk up with the butter another 30 seconds because we want the butter melted. Once your mixture is below that 115, which mine is, now we're going to add 1 egg and we're going to whisk that in. With your milk and butter mixture about that 115 mark, we don't take any chances of your egg curdling. And then of course I'm just going to repeat with my second batch here. And then just set your butter and milk mixture aside. All right, so now we're going to mix the dry ingredients together. So this is where my recipe's going to vary just slightly between the two because I'm adding two different types of flours. So one of them, I'm using fine white rice flour. Now, white rice flour is just, even though it's finely ground, it's a little bit grainy. It just sticks to my fingers, so it's still fine. We're gonna add 320 grams, which is 2 cups of the rice flour. Okay, that's all I want to do with the rice flour. Okay, so then the gluten-free mix. Look at the gluten-free mix. It's very fine. It feels like flour, whereas the rice flour just has a little bit of a grain to it, similar to cornmeal, but it's, again, very fine. This one is finer because it does have white rice flour in it, but it's got a lot of other things too. So this is definitely going to produce more of a regular flour type stretch in the bread. But since this flour for me is a little bit clumpy, I'm going to strain it. However, you do not have to sift your flour. In fact, I usually don't. But the last couple of batches of these rolls that I've made, I had little spots of white in my roll because it just didn't get mixed in well enough. And I know it was because of the clumps. Okay, take a look at the different types of flour. So the one that I'm shaking is the gluten-free mix. The one on the left that I'm shaking is the rice flour. So the rice flour has a little bit of a grain to it. The gluten-free mix is a pretty smooth one that looks like regular flour. Okay, and we're going to add the exact same ingredients to both of these. So to both, we're going to add 92 grams, which is 3/4 of a cup of tapioca flour. Add 8 grams, which is 2 teaspoons of xanthan gum. And that just creates the sort of that stretch. That's why we have to have gums in gluten-free baking. We're gonna add 8 grams, which is 2 teaspoons of baking powder. This will give it the acid that the bread needs to rise. We're gonna add 6 grams, which was 1 teaspoon of salt. Okay, we're gonna add the remaining sugar, from which we took 1 tablespoon to activate the yeast. Give your dry mixture a good mix so that we don't have any one ingredient concentrated in one bite of our bread. Okay, bake it well in the center of your flour mixture. You're gonna pour in the milk mixture. Notice how much our yeast has bloomed. So now we're gonna add that to the milk mixture. Okay, and then give your mixture a good whisk and a stir. Now, be sure that you mix this really well. So even when you think you've mixed it enough, give about another 30 seconds to a minute of a stir to ensure you've got a good mix going on here. Now take a look. Gluten-free bread is very different from regular bread. Look at that. It looks like more like a thick batter, like a thick, quick bread batter. It's not, the gluten just doesn't exist. So you're not going to have any kind of that stretch. And it just knows how it just separates. It doesn't stick together. So it's very different from our regular flour bread. This is the gluten-free flour mix. This is the white rice flour. Notice that actually the color looks a little bit different. Since this is all white rice, there's no brown rice flour in it, which is what is often in a gluten-free mix. It looks a lot lighter in color. In fact, this to me looks more like mashed potatoes with lots of butter in them. They've got that sort of that look to them. They've got that feel to them. But this is going to be a cleaner version in the sense that you have less processed and less ingredients. The gluten-free flour mix feels a little bit tougher, meaning that it has more of that bread dough feel to it. This one feels smoother, more like a mashed potato feel to it. Now it's time to roll them out. I'm going to leave my gluten-free flour mix aside for now. And I'm only going to work with the white rice flour. So you need to be able to knead on a work surface. So we're going to be using both rice flour and tapioca flour, or starch, whichever one you had. And that's what I want to use to flour my surface and my hands, because those are the flours that are in this recipe. So that's what you're likely going to have already in hand. So I just like to do a little mix, and then we're just going to place the batter. I call it batter instead of dough because it looks like batter to me, but it is technically your bread dough. We're going to place it on top of the floured surface. Make sure you flour well. Knead this dough a bit so that it can be easy to work with. Keep your hands floured. And see, notice it kneads like a bread dough. We're just going to knead it enough, just a few turns here. We would have flattened it out to about 1 inch thick. I'm going to give mine a little bit of a roll so we have a pretty roll to look at. And then you can pick whatever size you want to cut out. I like a 3-inch circle. 3 inches will give me 8 rolls. You could go smaller than that if you like, but I love bread, so I go for the bigger one. If you don't have a biscuit cutter, you could use just a glass and then just go along and cut out your rolls. So that's what they'll look like. And then place them in your baking pan. I would get 2 across and 4 down. That'll give me 8 rolls. And then you just repeat. And notice how quickly and easily they shape into the rolls. They cut very easily. You see that? And then whatever's left over, you can reshape the dough. Now this is a dough that doesn't hurt or toughens up when you re-knead it and roll it out. And we just need 2 more rolls out of this. All right, I have a little bit of dough left over, and I have all 8 in the pan. Notice they're pretty high already. They are definitely 1 inch thick. But the good thing about this recipe is that you can reshape these rolls. If you don't like the height of these, then go ahead and put them back together, knead them, and then re-roll them out. I do that all the time. And then you can get pretty much that perfect shape that you want without having to destroy the texture and integrity of the dough. So set them aside, either cover them with a towel or plastic wrap for at least 30 minutes, close to 1 hour, and then preheat the oven at 350 during the last 30 minutes of the rise. Now we're ready to roll out our second batch here. This is the gluten-free mix, and I use regular gluten-free flour for my board, my work surface, and to flour my hands. This still looks like a batter. It has a little bit more of a stretch to it than the plain old white rice flour. Flour your hands and give this a little knead. No serious kneading, just sort of getting the dough in a nice smooth shape so that we can cut it out. This dough is going to work very similar to the rice flour only. Still feels like that batter. I'm going to do a little bit of a roll to get that smooth top. You're looking for that 1 inch thick size. So it's a relatively small disc, and then start cutting out your rounds. Look at that, looks a lot like the other one. It's got a nice height to it. It's got smooth edges since we rolled it out, so it's pretty dough. Just like with the other one, we're gonna make 8 of these. Place each in a pan, 2 across, 4 down. If you don't want to take the time to roll those out, you don't have to. A lot of times, I will do drop rolls, like drop biscuits, where I just divide my dough when it's still in the batter, in the bowl. I just sort of eyeball 8, grab, a handful of it, and then just drop it down in the pan. And they look like drop biscuits at that point, but you still get that yeasty flavor from a yeast roll. Okay, so same with the other one. Cover, set aside 30 minutes to an hour, and then you're gonna bake these for at 350 degrees in the oven. Okay, our rolls have been rising for about an hour, 45 minutes, I suppose. So now it's time to place them in the oven. Notice how nice and much they've risen. They're very close together, pretty much taking up the pan. So they're gonna go in the oven for 25 minutes or until golden brown. The white rice rolls are coming out of the oven, so we're about to put the gluten-free flour mix rolls in the oven to bake. So notice they've risen nicely. They're definitely a tall looking roll. White rice rolls are out of the oven. Notice how beautiful they are, nice and golden brown on top. They look like a regular roll, don't they? So what I like to do is take some softened butter and then brush them immediately over the tops. I do this with my regular roll recipes. Butter just makes everything a little better. You get around the edges too. They do separate really easily, as you can see. You just need about 1 or 2 tablespoons of butter if you choose to do this. All right, they can be eaten immediately, but we're gonna wait till the other batch comes out so that we can compare them. The gluten-free flour mix rolls are now out of the oven. So we're gonna do the same as we did before. Brush these with some butter. Both of these to me look more like biscuits than a yeast roll. But remember, we don't have the gluten in these, so they're not gonna have that soft rise and a stretch. Okay, up on first look, this is our white rice flour version, and this is the gluten-free flour version. They look very similar, right? They cooked for the same amount of time. The white rice, there is a little bit of a tear there. Surprisingly, you would think it would because it's a simple white rice flour. But it does, probably from the tapioca starch. All right, let's look at the gluten-free flour. We'll get a tear into that one. That one definitely has more of a stretch that resembles gluten. I think that the white rice has more of a slightly grainier texture to it. So to me, it's like a cross between a biscuit and a cornbread. This one looks more like a roll or a biscuit. There's definitely a pull to it. Clearly, both of these are very dense. So they're going to be denser than a regular roll. The reason is because the gluten is absent and there is no gas from the yeast present within the gluten fibers to make it rise and be light and fluffy. They're yeasty, they smell yeasty, they just to me look more like a biscuit. I like them both. If I want a cleaner roll without as much processing, I will go with the white rice flour. I do think that the gluten-free flour has more of a regular roll feel to it. So if that's really important to you, go for the gluten-free mixed flour. But if you kind of like that biscuit cornbread feel, white rice flour is a great option. Both of these yeast rolls are good alternatives to regular flour yeast rolls. If you're used to eating gluten-free, then you'll understand that they will not taste, look, or feel exactly like regular bread. Nevertheless, baking and eating gluten-free can still make you happy, be satisfying, and taste incredibly good, especially a hot roll with butter. The flavors are different between the two of them. For the white rice flour version, you definitely taste that rice flour, but it's still a good roll. For the gluten-free flour mix, it has more of a milder flavor that's more like a regular flour roll. Both recipes make really good cinnamon rolls. I've done that many times with both recipes. You won't go wrong with either one for that one. If you have gluten-free eaters for the holidays or any time of year, consider trying one of these recipes. I find it to be a good alternative that makes me feel like I'm eating regular flour bread. Thanks for watching, liking, and subscribing. Until next time, go bake the world.